Our next session is looking at the impacts of possible privacy reform on programmatic digital out-of-home. We did touch on this earlier in the Tech Lab session. We've got two experts coming from two different angles to talk to you today. All right, we might... Shush. Sorry, I hate being a school teacher. Sarah Wallerton, who's our Director of Policy and Reg Affairs, who's all my team members are in demand, but at the moment is probably the most in demand, who's running from event to event to briefing at the moment while we're in the midst of responding to government on privacy reform. So Sarah comes from very much a regulatory point of view, how we make all this work. Joined by Dan Richardson from Yahoo, expert from a data point of view, omnichannel programmatic, and hopefully these two will be able to bring those two pieces together and help guide us in terms of what might be at risk and how the industry might move forward. Over to you guys.
Thanks so much, Gay. We're just saying outside, it's been a mad rush to get to today. Poor Dan's just got off a plane from Singapore and I've just got off another panel, and we've had limited time to actually talk to each other about this session, but we hope that it will be useful.
Yeah, high demand. I don't think we've ever talked so much about privacy. So definitely keeping us learning every day and in a job. So I'm going to actually start off and ask a few questions of yourself, Sarah, as the Director of Regulatory Affairs and Policy, dealing with policymakers and everyone here today. I know you're doing a lot of work with the privacy reform, collecting everyone's feedback, trying to digest that and explain it to all of us. I don't know how many have read the 200-page submission. Maybe you've read the Cliff Notes. Guilty, still learning, reading every day. But maybe you can start, Sarah, by giving us a quick overview of the privacy review, and then we'll go into why that's relevant for the digital out-of-home industry.
That sounds great. Thanks, Dan. So this process has been going for some time. You might be aware there have been a couple of issues papers and discussion papers already. And so what has happened now is that the government has released a report which contains some more really concrete proposals. It's not draft legislation yet, but it is, there are 110 fairly concrete proposals about what the government wants to do in the privacy space. And really, if looking at those proposals, if all of them were taken together, we would be looking at some really substantial reform to digital advertising. It's huge. Perhaps to give an overview of what the key changes are, starting with a positive, the report, the good thing about the report is it sets out the scope of the Act by defining personal information really as linked to privacy harms and linked to the definition of personal information. So it purports to regulate personal information, not all data, which is really critical because obviously data, is so important for the functioning of the digital economy. So that's a positive, but then it sort of quickly falls down a bit when we get to advertising, where it is a bit inconsistent with that setting up of personal information, and it really goes beyond regulating privacy to regulating data more broadly, and we think it's quite problematic. So the definition of targeting, essentially the proposal is that consumers should be able to opt out of any form of data segmentation, regardless of the size of the segment and regardless of whether the segmentation is based on personal information or de-identified data or even unidentified data. So we think that's problematic on a number of levels. So first of all, just from an operational perspective, and we're sort of talking about, which bits are more relevant for digital out-of-home and which aren't, but generally for digital advertising, if you can't even put someone in a segment for New South Wales, then they might receive an offer for a resident of Victoria. Like, that's really, really problematic from an operational perspective and doesn't really work. From a policy and regulatory perspective, they're also proposing to let people opt out of exclusion targeting. And so, that really is a key way that digital advertising companies implement online safety policies. For example, protect ads going to children, or protect, like gambling ads, or protect certain types of offers going to vulnerable people, for example, credit card offers, to certain demographics. So that's also something that needs to be kind of considered when we're looking at these proposals, and doesn't seem to be something the government has really looked at.
So it's pretty far-reaching. I know we were talking about Move before, panel of 5,000 survey participants. When we're planning digital at home, for example, we're using large cohorts, de-identified aggregate data. It seems pretty safe, but what you're saying is that any size of segment could be out of scope.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly, Dan. And I think the thing is, I'm not sure this is actually the government's intention, and I'm pretty sure it isn't, but it's just how they've drafted the report at the moment. Where we're at the moment is we need to explain that to them, because how they've described the definition, it would capture.
And point to question, how engaged are they in understanding what we do as an industry? Because what I've observed is we're actually all trying to understand how everything works.
Yeah.
So how do we get them on that journey as well? And then you've got consumers after that.
Oh, look, Dan, it's really hard. I mean, I think...
Go down to Canberra and try and explain it to...
Exactly. Like, I feel like it's, it's taken me as a lawyer coming into, being part of the industry, but this aspect of the industry was quite new. It takes a while to really get up to speed with exactly the detail and complexity of how digital advertising works. So in one sense, the government can be forgiven for not having a really good grasp of that detail, and you can see that from the report. They sort of skirt around some of the issues. That they understand it to an extent, but there's definitely work for us to do in that regard. So we will be attempting to do that, in the upcoming consultation period. And the one other thing I'd just say about the targeting proposal is that they're also saying that it should be an unqualified opt-out right. So essentially what that means is that even if if a consumer opts out, essentially the business still has to provide them with the service, even if that business is based on personalisation, for example. So, there's a point at which so that consumer won't be monetisable to that business. And then there's a tipping point at which that doesn't become viable if enough people opt out. So that's another point, I think.
And I think that fundamentally changes the way that you produce things like ad-funded content. You can use certain types of segmentation, but the really desirable stuff that often gets a higher price might be thrown out, at least for web and app-based ads. And we've seen today how that data is flowing through to all the planning and activation of digital at home as well, particularly with device IDs and mobile behaviour.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I know there's a lot of talk about consent, opt-out. I'd like to go into that for a moment. I think it's more straightforward if you're an app publisher or web publisher or brand to talk to your customer or consumer about how you're using data. But it was Christina before said you can't log into a billboard, which is cuts straight to the heart of it. How should the digital out-of-home industry be thinking about processing, collecting consent, talking to consumers in that way, given they can't have that direct relationship? Is it really just on their vendors and partners or brands? How would you approach that?
Yeah, well, so essentially, and this is where sort of the practical side you'll know much better than I do, but essentially with consent, where consent is required, it's generally in relation to the collection, use or disclosure of personal information. So, it's really at that point of collection, use or disclosure that you do need to get consent. So if that is something that your business is doing, then you do need to understand exactly what is required in this area. And that sort of goes to another point that this report is proposing to do. So there is a proposed move away from a consent-centric approach to privacy through this new proposed fair and reasonable requirement. But you know, that we've still got to work through exactly what that looks like and, you know, what it all means.
Are you able to have a stab at it now? Because whenever I say reasonable on a contract, it worries me. Because it could mean anything, really. Sometimes in your favour, sometimes against.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean with regards to targeted ads?
What I will say is we you know, what we've asked the government is to give us assurances that basic data processing, like research, analytics, things like that, that they will come within the scope of the law, and that they would be considered reasonable and they would be considered fair if the government, you know, go ahead with this test, and that we wouldn't have to, we wouldn't find ourselves in a position where really basic data processing would be contrary to the law. And that is something that other jurisdictions have taken into account. For example, under GDPR, there's actually this legal mechanism that basically allows for businesses to weigh up competing interests and allows for basic data processing. And the UK has introduced a bill and is going even further and allowing things like, you know, trading and sharing of personal information, just making it really clear that they can be considered as legitimate interests. So I think there's a lot that Australia can learn from other jurisdictions, but on the definition of fair and reasonable, I think we've still got to have a bit of a further discussion with government and a bit of an argument about exactly how that's framed. So, yeah.
I am going to go into another area, and it's a little bit tricky, but we've heard a lot about mobility, location data today. I think, well, we know there's huge change
next. So the actual, the operational side of that is also to come once we've got an idea of what the legislative framework looks like.
The good thing is that the OAIC are talking about assisting with that, which was a great relief to me, because I just don't really understand how because consent generally means, you know, of the individual, otherwise it's not consent. And they're increasing, you know, what consent means. They're making that stricter. They're saying it has to be unambiguous, it has to be specific, you know, all of that. So, and that is consent of an actual individual. So how does a consent framework sit over the top of that? Yeah, we've got to work through that.
Yeah, there are actually two sets of specs. One is for the individual, specifically, almost regardless of territory or legislative frameworks, so that there's a consistent, persistent experience of the selections that they've made. And then the second one, known as GPP, which is those specs are out, which TCF is actually part of. That's for the legislative, say for Australia, or actually randomly certain states within the US or Canada. So there are actually two sets of specs for that. But yeah, getting help from government on us working on that as an industry would be critical.
Thanks, JJ. And if you need an explainer of transparency and consent framework, TCF, any acronyms, I'm sure it's living on the website or the Tech Lab info there. And yeah, I think I'd like to thank Sarah actually for helping us digest a very dense piece of reform. And I think it's due, submissions and feedback are due today.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. So you've still got time to have your say.
They are granting extensions, just quietly.
Good to know. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Dan.
Any more questions from the floor? Hang on. Oh, are we out? Are we out of time? No, let's get the questions going.
Hey.
What's the timeline to legislation? So there's 110 recommendations that to be reviewed. When's D-Day?
Very good question. So it's unclear at the moment. There's a lot of talk about introduction of legislation into the Parliament this year. I suspect what will happen is once submissions are in and they've digested them, they'll probably put out a timetable and then we'll have a better idea. But the talk on the street is legislation will be introduced We'll then, in our submission, I think as well, we'll need to ask for a decent transitional period. And, ideally all of the OAIC, assistance with templates and things would be in place before anything comes in. So I still think before it actually comes into effect, minimum a year, but I'm kind of guessing there, so yeah.
They've got to wait and see the feedback, right? Because there's going to be quite a lot.
Hi, I can't see anyone over there, but I'm over here. In terms of the parity to GDPR, how much difference is there between the GDPR legislations and the reform that's being proposed?
There are similarities and differences. It's not the same. The targeting, for example, we're doing something on our own there. Sorry, I should probably say, yeah, we're doing something completely on our own on targeting. Also, they sort of grab bits and pieces from other jurisdictions as well, like fair and reasonable. It's a combo. It's a mixed bag. So ultimately, every business will need to work out for itself what it means. It's not identical. Yeah.
I think a lot of the data providers that we would typically interact with, I guess they have their own data providers, and those data providers, like there's a supply chain here. Given, the probability of some of this stuff landing and there being at least some restriction, how much front running are we doing as an industry to get on top of making sure that the entire supply chain is compliant?
Well, that's a good question, and JJ, you might have a view on that.
Yeah, so we've spoken to a number of what are classified in the proposals as data brokers, which is actually quite broad when you look at it. And the good thing is that not only are they active in this market, but a lot of them are European-based, even UK-based in particular. So we've had some good discussions with some heads of privacy and some of the operational folks in London that give us case studies and give us some frameworks to lean on in terms of helping the response. I think that's been really useful.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, so data brokers are a whole other sort of bag under this proposed reform, and I think they're also misunderstood. And I think there's also, and we will be in our submission talking about the fact that actually they play an important role in that supply chain, and the laws need to be reasonable in relation to them as well. So there are bits that there seems to be a bit of a perception that actually data brokers sort of sprinkle personal information all over the digital economy, and we need to sort of, really, it's why it's really important to sort of draw a distinction between anonymised and de-identified data, which is most of what data brokers work with, and that's really beneficial to businesses across the economy, and personal information. So, does that sort of answer your question?
Sort of, I guess the thrust of it is like what planning should operators, advertisers, anybody in this industry be doing to I guess prepare for a potential data apocalypse or at worst, or a lack of available data.
Okay. Well, step one is we argue for to get rid of the worst sort of proposals that will mean that there's no data. I think the industry is doing a lot of work on privacy safe practices with data, like this is where the pets and the clean rooms and all of those practices will be essential in the future. I think it's really unrealistic to think that we won't be reliant on data. I think the government itself wants Australia to be a leading digital economy by 2030. So to do that, we're going to have to, work out how to use data safely, and there are ways. And so it's really important through this process to make sure that there is a distinction between that the privacy safe practices aren't actually outlawed and disincentivised, and that we're appropriately targeting the law. So I guess that's one point. On a much more practical level, I guess each organisation probably at this stage should be doing an audit and understanding where the risk areas are for the organisation, what it has, what its contracts say, and so that it can move at the right time when we know what we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, and I think just to add that, I mean, that's something which we probably didn't look into as much in the past, but, it's really critical now to look into how your vendors are set up, where they're licensing data, governance, data lifecycle management, and take learning. So if you look at some of Yahoo's learnings from whether it's the Apple opt-out or CCPA in the States, you can't just bring on another movement data vendor and expect a big jump in scale. That there's actually not much incremental reach to be gained. There's a huge overlap there, and that takes time to work through. Availability of the data and consented or opted in consumers is really getting harder.
Yeah.
And also the opportunity to actually engage in this process. So the submissions are to respond back to those proposals and have a discussion around them. So there's a collaborative submission from IB Australia where we're trying to get as many of the members across it as possible, but the other industry bodies are doing the same, OMA, MFA, AANA, and we're all swapping notes. So we're trying to be as aligned as possible as an industry on those key topics to avoid the apocalypse. All right.
Hi, Tom Fogden from BNC. These privacy changes, whether they're in Australia or anywhere else in the world, presumably stem from the perception that digital advertising is, quote, like creepy. How do we, as an industry, actually kind of get around that and make people, whether it's consumers or government, understand that it's not necessarily creepy?
Yeah, another really good question. And this goes to I think the misunderstanding of targeting as well, which is seen from what's proposed. So I think the consumer perceives targeting to be, company A has actually, based on my specific individual personal information, is following me around and making me offers and has all this dirt on me. But actually, generally how targeting works is putting people into reasonably large segments to differing degrees, and you're targeted as a group of people, not as an individual. But it's just what it can feel like to the consumer sometimes. Arguably, when personalisation isn't working as well as it should, that can feel creepy. And to be honest, it's a different discussion. It's actually not a privacy discussion because it doesn't impact on the privacy of the individual. That creepiness is more like, it's a trading practice. It's potentially, arguably, an unfair trading practice if it meets that threshold. But it's not really a privacy harm because it's not related to the individual's personal information or identity. But there's a lot of work to be done. I would give our adding value report a plug here. So there's work for us to do in terms of talking about the value of what digital advertising offers and the value exchange with the consumer and making sure people understand that better as well.
Yeah, and there are crap executions, right? Some of the retargeting experiences, we went too far on the one-to-one thing. I think we'll all admit that as an industry, we got a bit obsessed by that targeting regardless of the environment, and there's been pullback there, and part of that has been the consumer privacy push. So there's been a lot of learnings in that space.
Sedgwick from Unmade. My question is, in the progression of this policy proposal here in Australia, who do you believe to be the most critical stakeholder to manage?
Most critical stakeholder for the government to manage?
Yeah.
Look, I think they are, obviously all of the data breaches that have come to light in the last little while, I think they are really concerned to protect. They see it as a massive issue, a massive risk on on a number of fronts, and they do see it as a large political risk, but also it's a massive risk for consumers when their data is found on the dark web or stolen by some company. So I think they're really focused on making sure that there's something in place that protects consumers sufficiently. It's just that, when you get down into the detail of digital advertising, there's a lot to be worked through to make sure it's practical. So the most critical stakeholder is a hard one to sort of answer. I think sort of the key goal will be ensuring the safety of consumers and that privacy and personal information is secure and protected by large companies. And I don't think they believe that it is at the moment, because that's not the evidence when you look at the news and see all these data breaches.
Give it a bit of time, it'll be Sarah. That'll be who they're most worried about.
Given that, do you think that the outcomes of the proposal might come at the detriment of the larger companies, in order to appease the consumers or, protect them?
I don't know. I think it will impact everyone. And to be honest, I think any cross-economy law or policy has the potential to actually impact the smaller companies more, because it's more expensive. It's relatively more expensive for them, given their budgets, etc., to manage those changes. So I would say not necessarily. No, I think small and medium enterprises will be.
I'd have to agree. The smaller you are, the more dependent you are on data trading or brokering it from other people to help you understand your audience. So it actually may benefit the bigger players.
Yeah, exactly.
Potentially.
All right. I think a round of applause for these two. That was excellent.